One of the dark spots on the history of pretty much every country's past is slavery. China is no exception to this, and its slave past reaches back even further than most, spanning back almost 3,000 years. Slavery in China was quite a bit different than slavery in other parts of the world, from who the slaves were to life after being a slave. Stick around to learn more. Welcome to Crazy Histories, where we bring you the craziest and weirdest facts from human history. Some of the things discussed in this video may be offensive or disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Chinese peasants. One of the most important things to know when it comes to learning about slavery in ancient China is that it's quite different from the slavery that took place in the United States. The slavery in the U.S. was a racial-based form of chattel slavery. In China, though, the line between slavery and the peasant class was much more fluid. One of the most shocking things about slavery in ancient China is how similar a slave's life was to that of a free commoner. Both groups were very poor and spent their life serving the upper classes. Both slaves and free poor people would have lived on or near the land they worked on and would not have had the means to leave. One of the biggest differences between slaves and commoners was that commoners were able to own land, slaves could not. Peasants were allowed to leave their homes while slaves were forced to live in the same spot for as long as they were enslaved. Just because peasants were allowed to leave, though, doesn't mean they did. It was dangerous and expensive to leave one's home, and so it would have been difficult for a peasant to do so. Another big difference between the two classes is the level of abuse they would have suffered. Both groups were allowed to be beaten by the upper classes or people that owned the land they lived and worked on. However, slaves would have gotten it much worse than free folk, since they were expected to be 100% obedient. History of Chinese slavery. Like we said in the introduction to this video, the history of Chinese slavery goes back way further than any other nation. The first recorded slaves go all the way back to 1000 BCE. During this time, slaves not only served their master during life, but also during the afterlife. When a wealthy man died, it was common for his entire slave staff to be killed and buried with him, so that they could travel to the afterlife with him and ensure that he not only had a safe journey, but that he'd be taken care of for eternity. The importance and use of slavery changed over time. Some dynasties relied heavily on enslaved people, while other dynasties took measures to outlaw it. Because of this, it's hard to talk about slavery in ancient China in a general sense. In the near 3,000 years that slavery was legal, it changed a lot. Earlier we said that slavery wasn't racially based, and while that's true, it isn't quite that simple. Slaves of different races could fetch more than other races. For example, African slaves could be found in China as early as 600 CE, in thanks to the Silk Road. However, that doesn't mean that there were a lot of African slaves. This means that the ones that were in China would be more expensive because they were so different looking than most slaves. So the wealthiest families would probably have owned a few African slaves to show off the fact that they had the money to afford them. Becoming a slave. This is kind of a hard thing to quickly answer since, like we said earlier, slavery changed over time. During the Shang and Zhou dynasties, roughly 1300 to 300 BCE, the slave class was mostly made up of war criminals or war prisoners. In the later periods, the line between commoner and slave became even more blurred than it already was, as people began to sell themselves into slavery. They would do this as a way to avoid paying taxes or to save themselves from starvation. The people that sold themselves were generally considered to be in the higher class than other slaves, although they were still below the free commoners. If a man had a family and couldn't sell himself, he could also sell his wife or children into slavery to satisfy a debt or because he couldn't afford to feed them. If a man sold a child, then it was nearly always a daughter. Sons were able to inherit land and could carry on the family name. Daughters were much more of a burden in this society, and so it was much more beneficial to have one less girl. There was actually a law at one point that said a man wasn't allowed to sell a member of his family unless doing so would save others in his family from starvation. Unfortunately, this wasn't strictly enforced, and many people became slaves like this anyway. Every time a person was sold into slavery like this, a slave contract was written up. At least this was supposed to be the case. This contract said who was being sold to who and who was doing the selling. It also laid out a number of years that the now slave was going to be working for the new owner, which was generally 10 to 15 years, and how much money was going to be given for the slave. Another way that someone might find themselves a slave is by committing a crime. One of the common ways criminals were punished was by forcing them into slavery. If their crime was bad enough, criminals might also see their family members become slaves, or they wouldn't see this happen since the criminal got executed. Boys versus girls. A lot of what a slave's experience would be like depended on their gender. Ancient China was a very patriarchal society, meaning that girls were sold into slavery far more often than boys were. This meant that boys could be sold for a much higher price than girls could, and that having boy slaves was a status symbol. Owning boys meant that you could afford more expensive things. That doesn't mean that male slaves were treated any better. In fact, in general, men and boys were given harder and more demanding tasks than girls and women were. Female slaves were not distinguished by the type of work they did, but by if they were married or not. Married slave women were more like employees than slaves. They were paid a wage, though a very small one, and were allowed to leave their master's grounds when they weren't working. Single slave women, on the other hand, were not paid and were not allowed to be off-duty. Life after a slave's contract was up also depended on their gender. After male slaves were released from their position, they were often left to fend for themselves. Sometimes, if the owner was particularly fond of a boy, he would arrange a marriage for him. On the other hand, girls and women would usually have something written in their slave contract that said that the owner would arrange for their marriage. If it didn't say anything like that, they would usually go back to their families. Daily life. As you might expect, the lives of slaves were not easy. What exactly would happen in the day-to-day would obviously depend on what their job was. Regardless of where they lived and worked, slaves could be brutally punished for not working hard enough or for disobedience. Unlike in other places that had slaves, it was against Chinese law to kill your slaves as a punishment. This almost doesn't matter, though. Slaves were so neglected that it was pretty normal for slaves to die from even the smallest thing. Slaves generally worked in fields, though some were used in construction projects, in the royal households, or even in government positions. Though the slaves that worked in farming communities or construction sites would have faced back-breaking work, those in the royal households would have been under constant scrutiny. They would also have been more likely to experience daily humiliation and cruelty from their owners. Although slavery existed throughout Chinese history, China never turned into a structural slave society like other ancient cultures. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why that may be, but it's likely because there was a massive peasant class and labor was already very cheap. Which part of a slave life in ancient China surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and then be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel.